Okay, guys, I want to quickly put an answer to the 4 points that the Jehovah Witness members normally raise to try to explain that Jesus is not God and Jesus cannot be God. Yes, the very first one is 1 Corinthians 11, verse 3. I would have you know that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of the woman is the man, and the head of Christ is God. So the emphasis is on the head of Christ is God. So because the head of Christ is God, Christ cannot also be God. All through the Bible, there are different contexts where when you just mention the word God, you know who you are talking about. You just know that this one you are referring to the Father. Yes, there are contexts like that. It does not mean that Jesus is no longer God. For instance, like the royalty illustration that I gave before, the prince, the head of the prince is the king. And when we say royalty, the head of royalty in a particular kingdom is the king, the father. And so when we mention royalty, we understand that the first person that comes to mind is the king. Yes, is the father. All right. So the same thing happens in this context in the Bible, where when you mention God, the first person that comes to mind is God the Father. So we understand that, but it does not erase the fact that the prince is also 100% royalty, or that Jesus is also 100% royalty. Moreover, I'm not arguing against the Father being the head of Christ. So we already mentioned that within the Godhead there is hierarchy, and the Father occupies a higher role, a higher function, not a higher nature. They all have the same nature, the same God nature. But in terms of function, the Father occupies a higher function as the King, right? So it is okay, it makes sense to say the head of Christ is God. Within that context, we are talking about God the Father. So we are not breaking any rule. So the second point that they raise to try to explain that Jesus is not God and cannot be God is in 1 Corinthians 15 from verse 22 to 28. It's a very long reading, and I'm not going to go through all that. But the main emphasis is in verse 24 and verse 28. So when I start from verse 22, it says, "For as in Adam all die, even so in Christ shall all be made alive." Verse 23, "But every man in his own order, Christ the first fruits, afterward they that are Christ at his coming." Verse 24, "Then cometh the end, when he shall have delivered up the kingdom to God, even the Father. When he shall have put down all rule and all authority and power." You see the first thing I explained before. You see how that verse 24 explained it. Before I bring up what their point is, I just saw something here now that I didn't see before. That verse 24 gave us how to understand things in context. That when God is mentioned in some context, it's referring to the Father. Yes, in this context, referring to the Father. It's not trying. That does not mean that the Father is the only person that is God, that has the 100% God nature. All right. Look at how this King James puts it. It says, "Then commence the end," verse 24. "Then commence the end, when he shall have delivered up the kingdom to God." Now said the command, even the Father. So laying emphasis that the God we are talking about here is the Father. Whereas there are some verses that they will not lay more emphasis. They will just say to God. Like the first verse we read, that 1 Corinthians 11 verse 3, that said the head of Christ is God. He didn't bother to lay emphasis. But with common sense, with normal understanding of English and context, you know that that place, the context of that place is talking about God the Father. That the head of Christ is God the Father. Okay? But thank God 1 Corinthians 15 verse 24 helped us to understand the context, the person that is being described as God in this place. That is why he went on to say, "Have delivered up the kingdom to God, even the Father." All right, so that we will know, giving us more emphasis to let us know the particular person of the Godhead that we are talking about. That is why I went on to say, even the Father. All right, so I think that is something to help us understand context in the usage of the word God. Yes, and then the point they normally try to raise, or in this place. Okay, let me come down to verse 28. It says, "And when all things shall be subdued unto him, then shall the Son also himself be subject unto him that put all things under him, that God may be all in all." So the God here, from the context, we are talking about the Father. But the point they try to raise is that Christ is going to be subject unto God after the whole coming to take people and everything. After we finally settle down, God and Christ is going to settle, or is going to be subjected unto the Father. It's going to be subject to the Father, submit to the Father. Even verse 24 told us that it's going to deliver the kingdom to God. Right? Talking about God the Father, is going to deliver the kingdom to God. And so they try to say, you see, Christ is not equal to the Father. Jesus is not equal to the Father. Since he's going to be submitting everything to the Father, he's going to be subjecting to the Father. You see, their reason does not even make any sense here. All right? Because it's still showing that they think we are saying that Jesus is the same person as the Father. That is why they are making this accusation. They are trying to bring this as the point. That because Jesus is going to subject himself to the Father, or because Jesus is going to hand over the kingdom to the Father, it means that Jesus is not equal to the Father. Of course, Jesus is not equal to the Father in function, in role. The Father is higher in hierarchy as a king. All right? And so the Son, Jesus, delivers the kingdom to the Father. It's normal. It's a normal thing. All right, it's a normal thing. It does not mean that Jesus is now having a less nature as God. No, but in hierarchy, Jesus occupies a lower role as the Son. The Son is lower in function than the Father, not in nature. So that is why it makes sense for Jesus to be subjected to the Father and to hand over, deliver of the kingdom to the Father. So it does not remove anything from the God nature of Jesus. So that their point is basically useless. You get it? Their third point is in Revelation 3 verse 14. It says, "And unto the angel of the church of the Laodiceans write, These things saith the Amen, the faithful and true witness, the beginning of the creation of God." So this place is describing Jesus. It's Jesus talking. So Jesus is described here as the beginning of the creation of God. And so they are saying that because Jesus is called the beginning of the creation of God, it therefore means that Jesus is the first to be created. That is to say, Jesus was created. And so if Jesus was created, Jesus cannot be God since he was created. Since God cannot be created, God is not created, right? One of the things that make God God is eternal, that nature of eternity is eternal, right? So there is no beginning, there is no end. So he cannot be God cannot be created. And so if Jesus was created, according to them, they say that's what this place is saying. That the beginning, Jesus being the beginning of the creation of God, means that Jesus was created, was the first to be created. It means that Jesus has not been able to meet that requirement to be a God, to be God. You understand? Yes. So the problem I see here is that problem of modern English confusing our interpretation of the Bible that I mentioned before in the other post. Yes, our modern English, when we try to force it, use it to interpret everything in the Bible, it can bring some confusion. Because we see, it's easy for us to just look at this statement, Jesus, the beginning of the creation of God. It's easy for us to just look at it with our modern English and just conclude that this thing means Jesus is the first to be created. Is the first to be created. When Jesus was described or is called the beginning of God's creation, let's not hurry to just force our modern English into it. Let's understand it in the way the Bible speaks. Yes, the beginning of God's creation there simply means that Jesus is the origin of God's creation. That is to say, all of God's creation began inside Jesus. It follows the context of the Bible. It follows the context explained in Colossians 1. Yes, Colossians 1 verse 16. It says, "For by him were all things created, that are in heaven and that are in earth, visible and invisible, whether they be thrones or dominions or principalities or powers. All things were created by him and for him." Yes, and he's before all things, and by him all things consist. So the whole summary of that verse is that all things began inside Jesus. So when we call Jesus the beginning of God's creation, we are not saying, it does not mean, the Bible is not saying that Jesus is the first to be created. The Bible is rather saying Jesus is the source of all creation. Jesus is the origin of all creation. All creation has their beginning inside Jesus. So the beginning of all the creation, the origin of all creation is inside Jesus. It was in Jesus that all things were created. That is the meaning of that phrase, the beginning of God's creation. So it is not saying Jesus is the first to be created. Rather, Jesus is the origin, is the source. It is inside Jesus that all creation began. Let me use this illustration. If I am traveling, let's say I'm making a journey to 5 different states, and I currently live in Benin City, and then I moved first to Lagos, then I moved to Ibadan, moved to Oyo State, moved to Abuja, moved to Kano, you understand? Now, I moved to 5 different states. That's how the journey is. Remember, I started in Benin City, right? Benin City, I can say Benin City is the beginning of my journey. Benin City is the beginning of my journey. But I'm not going to count Benin City as part of my journey because I'm already in Benin City, right? So Benin City is not going to be counted among the number of states that I visited. Since the journey started from Benin City, the journey started in Benin City. So it was from Benin City the journey started. The origin of the whole journey is Benin City. But Benin City is not one of the states that I traveled to. So when I count the states I traveled inside that journey, I'm not going to count Benin City. I'm going to count the Lagos, the Abuja, the Oyo, the Kano. The other places make up the 5 states I traveled to. I'm not going to count Benin City. Yes, because Benin City is the origin of the journey. So it's not part of what I'm going to be counting. So it is, with that same line, we are saying that Jesus is the beginning of all creation. He's the origin of all creation. He's simply saying that all creation started inside Jesus. He's not trying to say Jesus was the first to be created. That's not the point. So the context of the Bible explains it, adds to that illustration. The fourth point that they use to try to explain that Jesus is not God and cannot be God is Colossians 1 verse 15. And it says, "Who is the image of the invisible God?" He's talking about Jesus. "Who is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of every creature." So the emphasis is on The firstborn of every creature. That Jesus is the firstborn of every creature. And so that means Jesus was born, the first to be born. And God cannot be born. So for Jesus to be born, to be firstborn, he is not qualified to be God. So that is their logic. All right? And again, they are making the same modern English error. Yes, they are trying to push into the Bible, used to interpret the Bible, ignoring the context, ignoring how the Bible uses words, uses phrases. Yes, they ignore all that, and they say that because Jesus is called the firstborn of every creature, it therefore means that Jesus is the first to be born. And so Jesus, there was a time that Jesus was born, that Jesus had a beginning. He had a beginning. There was a time he didn't exist, and then he was born. No, that's their logic. Now, before I continue into verse 16 to try to use the context to explain the meaning of that phrase, firstborn of every creature, I want to first show you that other places are there in the Bible where God used that word, firstborn, and yet it did not mean first to be born. Yes. The first one is Psalm 89, verse 27. Also, this is talking about David. Also, I will make him my firstborn, higher than the kings of the earth. Now, judge for yourself. God is saying that he's going to make David his firstborn. Right? His firstborn, higher than the kings of the earth. So, the use of that word firstborn, does it mean that David was going to be the first to be born, that David is the first to be born? Is that the meaning? You know, there's this thing I said in my last video, that these people, Jehovah's Witness organization, they like to, things where the Bible uses words figuratively, they take it literally. Where the Bible uses words literally, they take it figuratively. It's like they do it intentionally just to prove their point. All right? In this place, David is described as firstborn. But we all know that the David that we know, is not even close to the firstborn. He's not close to the secondborn. We know his story, right? He has a lot of elder brothers and all of that. So he's not the firstborn. But the context in which this statement was used, that David is going to be firstborn, is in terms of supremacy, in terms of rank. In terms of rank. So when you are talking about kings of the earth, David is going to, he's not the first king. So let's not even try to say he was the first king, so that's why he's firstborn. No. The idea of firstborn there is that David was going to be higher in rank, in supremacy. His kingship is going to be higher. That is the idea of that word firstborn. He's not trying to say David was the first person to be born among his brothers, or that he was the first king. He was not the first king. So obviously, that word firstborn does not mean first to be born in that case of David, right? The other one is Exodus 4, verse 22. This is God talking about Israel as a whole. He says, and thou shalt say unto Pharaoh, thus saith the Lord, Israel is my son, even my firstborn. So God is saying, Israel is my firstborn. And you and I, we know that Israel is not a literal firstborn. Right? Israel is not a literal firstborn. Jacob is the second son. Right? So for God to say, Israel is my firstborn, that does not mean that Israel is going to be the first or is the first to be born. So the idea is that Israel as a nation was going to have the highest rank, was going to be supreme or is supreme over all nations. That's the idea of that word, firstborn. So it does not make sense if when I came to Jesus, when Jesus was now called firstborn in Colossians 1 verse 15, all of a sudden we took that one literally. We took that one as a literal expression to say that means Jesus was the first to be born. That's crazy. We should not be hypocrites. We should be consistent. We should understand the Bible mood, Bible language. When Bible uses some certain words, we shouldn't behave like KGTV children and just take words and use them and push our meaning into it. Let's understand how the Bible talks. So we have seen that the way the Bible uses the word firstborn, in those cases, it did not mean literally firstborn, like the first was the first to be born. It's talking about supremacy, rank, importance, significance among other people. So let's come back to this Colossians 1:15 now. Let's see something here. Even the next verse gave us the context, the meaning of that phrase, firstborn of every creature. Look, verse 15 says, who is the image of the invisible God? Watch. The firstborn of every creature. See semicolon. The firstborn of every creature. He now went on to explain the meaning of that phrase, firstborn of every creature, based on that, the context, why he's using that phrase. You see the semicolon after firstborn of every creature? Then he now started with for by him. The word for there means because by him. So the reason we are calling Jesus the firstborn of every creature is because by him were all things created that are in heaven and that are in earth, visible and invisible. So the Bible explains itself. That's the problem we have when we are not patient enough to allow the Bible, the context, to explain itself. We are trying to force our doctrine into it. We are trying to force what our organization is imposing on us. We are trying to force it into the Bible. The next verse explains the meaning of that firstborn that Jesus was called. That Jesus was called the firstborn of every creature because it was by him all things were created. So in other words, Jesus is supreme over all. Jesus is supreme over all. That is the idea. If you look at verse 18, it says, and he is the head of the body, the church, who is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in all things he might have the preeminence. Other versions say supremacy, supreme, be supreme over all things. So that is the idea of that firstborn. Meanwhile, that verse 18 use the word, say the firstborn from the dead. This is a different language. We say firstborn from the dead. The use of firstborn here in verse 18 is talking about Jesus, the first to rise from the dead. Resurrection now. He's the first to rise from the dead. But the firstborn that Jehovah's Witness is trying to talk about from that verse 15 is that there was a time that Jesus did not exist at all. And the point now came that he was born. Yes, and he was the first to be born into existence. That's what they try to use that verse 15 to point out. All right? Yes. But verse 18 here, when it says firstborn from the dead, this one is a different usage. This one is talking about Jesus being the first to rise from the dead, the way he rose. He was the first. He's the example for the Christians to follow. The way he rose from the dead, that's how all the saints, all the Christians are also going to rise. No wonder all the people waited for him to rise first. And the day he rose, if you read the Bible very well, so that the graves were open, people also rose, So he's the first, gave us the example to rise from the dead. It's a different meaning. So when you look at that verse 15 from NLT, it says, Christ is the visible image of the invisible God. He existed before anything was created and is supreme over all creation. So that first point is just explaining the supremacy of Christ, that Christ is supreme over all. Just the way David, his kingship was supreme over all. That's why he was called firstborn, not because he was the first to be born. Israel was described as firstborn because they were supreme over all nations, not because they were the first nation to be created. So finally, on this matter of whether Jesus had a beginning or whether there was a time Jesus was born or created and all of that, I want to quickly say that there are some claims, some blasphemy you are going to be making when you try to insist that Jesus Christ had a beginning, that there was a time he was created or there was a time he was born. When you say that, what you are saying indirectly is that there was a time that God did not have a son. That's what you are saying, that there was a time that God did not have a son. That means God has not always been the Father. That means you are even trying to put a beginning to the nature of God the Father himself. That God the Father, there was a time he was not called a father. There was a time he was not a father. So the nature of God, no nature of God had a beginning. That is what I stand for. No nature of God had a beginning. God the Father, that's what I'm talking about. When I mention God now in this context, like I said, if I'm talking about the Father, right? So no nature, let me use your language now, Jehovah. No nature of Jehovah had a beginning. So if you say that Jesus had a beginning, there was a time that Jesus did not exist, you are indirectly saying that there was a time that Jehovah was not a father. And that is blasphemy, because God does not change. God does not change. So if there was a time that Jesus did not exist, it means there was a time that Jehovah was not a father. And if later on Jehovah now became a father, it means that the nature of God was improved with time. It means that there was an addition, there was a change to the nature of God, which contradicts the Bible. Because what God's word says is that God does not change. God's nature is eternal. There is no nature of God that has a beginning. So his fatherhood nature does not have a beginning. That means Jesus does not have a beginning. Because if Jesus has a beginning, then it means the fatherhood nature of Jehovah had a beginning too. That means you are saying the nature of the Father, the nature of Jehovah changed. There was a time it changed. So are you ready to make that kind of claim about Jehovah? I'm not trying to emotionally blackmail you or gaslight you, all right? I just want us to see where this whole logic fails, where it falls apart. So just look at the Bible by yourself and see things for yourself.